Joining us now, as he does each and every week for our weekly business and economics segment on the Megacast, is Dr. Michael Greiner, Assistant Professor of Management at Oakland University's School of Business Administration. Dr. Greiner, thanks for being with us today.
It's great to be back, Tyler. Happy Friday.
Yes, happy Friday to you as well. Not so much a happy Friday for those leaders in Washington, D.C. negotiating still on the debt ceiling crisis for the U.S. Now, this could have a big impact, of course, on the entire economy for the U.S. if the U.S. is not able to have its leaders reach some sort of a settlement on this and ultimately raise the debt ceiling and come to these concessions between the House Republican leadership and the Biden administration. But it could especially have some pretty serious effects on the state of Michigan. There was a report this week from CBS News Detroit about the impact from CBS News about the impact of the debt ceiling and how that could impact states all across the union. But in Michigan, this could have a big effect, Dr. Greiner.
Yeah, for sure. And in fact, this is based on a report that was done by Moody's Analytics. I believe Mark Zandi's the economist who did it. And what he did is he looked at kind of different options that would happen, if there were a short-term default, if there were a longer-term default, and what would be the implications. And part of the problem we're dealing with here is this never happened. So a lot of this is speculation. Some people say that this might be a minor bump. Some people say this might be worse than the Great Depression. The truth is it's probably somewhere in between the two. But no matter how you cut it, it's not a good thing. And it certainly is going to be something that will undermine the United States' credibility for a long term and certainly hurt our economy and both in the short term and the long term. But with this in the short run, the expectation is that the most affected places will be places that rely heavily on federal spending. So you'd be looking at places like Washington, D.C., for example, or Hawaii, where they have a lot of military bases, or Alaska, where they have a lot of federal lands. Things like that would probably be immediately impacted by the fact that the federal government basically wouldn't be able to pay its bills anymore. In the longer run, though, this would become a bigger issue nationwide, and certainly here in Michigan. And this comes down to that old saying of, when the country gets a cold, Michigan gets pneumonia. Well, they're predicting that the state that would get the highest unemployment as a result of this recession would be the state of Michigan. And they expect a 10.8% unemployment rate, which would be really something that we haven't seen, I don't even know when. That would certainly be worse than we saw back in 2008, 2009, in that recession back then. So we're talking a major impact on the state and certainly not something that we can see happen. Now, the good news is both sides have expressed the fact that they believe that having a default is not something that should be allowed. There appear to be some negotiations. There appear to be some progress. But who knows? This is a scary thing. This is really not something that should be trifled with, quite frankly.
And so what makes Michigan so vulnerable to, as you described, some pretty severe effects from even just some minor defaults from the U.S. government?
Yeah, it comes down to just our general openness to the economy as a whole. As a manufacturing state, we talk about how we try to diversify our economy, but fundamentally, Michigan is an auto state. We make autos, we design autos here, we engineer autos, we repair them. That's what Michigan is really all about. And yes, we have other things going on, but fundamentally, auto is what drives the state. Now, as with any kind of manufacturing, the issue that you have is you've got very high fixed costs. You've got this huge expense that you need to go through to build a factory, and then you have to essentially make predictions as to how much you're going to be selling so that you can then spread the cost of that factory across all of the vehicles that you're selling. Now, the problem comes up is if you don't sell as many vehicles as you predicted that you'd sell. And that can happen if you have a very rapid change in the economy. And that's what we've seen repeatedly, where, something that ends up being a slight change in the economy for many parts of the country hits Michigan especially hard, because all of a sudden the automakers aren't able to make enough profit to cover the expenses that they have just that are set, kind of built into the process of having the cost of having the factories and the machinery and the distribution mechanisms that are really quite expensive to run an auto operation, as Elon Musk has found out trying to put together Tesla. So As a result of that, even a slight decrease in economic activity ends up hitting Michigan especially hard, because all of a sudden these auto manufacturers are just not able to make their payments anymore. So that's, I think, what they're saying is going to be the basis for it, which is that a recession nationwide, which would be driven by things like the government not being able to make Social Security payments, for example. That would mean that people have less money in their pockets. They're not able to purchase new vehicles. That would then mean that we're not selling as many vehicles. Suddenly the automakers are having trouble making the payments that they have, and you suddenly find yourself in a severe recession.
And it's already a problem here in the state of Michigan, as we've seen over the last several years with the supply chain issues, with the inflation issues, that the average price of to buy a car has gone up by almost 25%, 24% across the board in the U.S. And it's gotten to the point where there's a report in the Oakland Press this week that people across America are holding onto their cars longer than ever before, as opposed to buying new cars or getting into new leases because of those issues. So it's already a problem in our state. It's already affecting our state's economy because of its still heavy reliance on the automotive industry. But should there be issues with this, with the debt ceiling and with America defaulting on some of its loans, even making that more of an inflated issue, no pun intended. Now, how could that really turn this into overdrive and really send Michigan's automotive industry into haywire?
Yeah, it is kind of concerning right now, because, and you're right to kind of put this within the context of what happened with the COVID recession and the issues that we had then with supply chains and the changes in spending behavior and all that stuff. Because what happened is, before COVID, we were selling about 17 million cars a year here in the United States. Now we're down to about 14 million. And the difference has everything to do with the fact that basically it's been harder for the auto manufacturers to make cars. Again, we had this situation where, as a result of COVID, there was this sudden change in purchasing behavior by people, where people at one point were doing things like going out to eat and going to the gym. Instead, suddenly they were buying appliances for the house, and they were they were buying Pelotons. We've all heard this story. And then, as the economy started opening up again, suddenly they shifted back again. And so there have been these rapid changes here in people's purchasing behavior. And that goes back to exactly what we were talking about earlier, which is, especially in manufacturing, you have to be able to anticipate these things, because you have to make these huge investments in factories and in equipment and in distribution systems, and then expect that you're going to be able to sell enough of whatever product it is that you're manufacturing that you're going to be able to essentially pay all your costs. And so they have to make these long-term predictions. And as a result, frankly, a lot of manufacturers, they employ a lot of economists to try to make these predictions. But you can see, if something unexpected happens that suddenly changes the way that people are buying, suddenly it throws everything into chaos. And all these plans, kind of that old saying of the best laid plans of mice and men. Well, certainly it's true with economists. And if that happens, then suddenly the manufacturers find themselves in a situation they're not able to pay their bills. And so we saw this, for example, where Peloton, for example, was doing great during the COVID recession, because everybody's buying Pelotons. They're not going to the gym anymore. Suddenly, the economy opens up much more rapidly than anybody expected. Suddenly, people aren't buying Pelotons anymore. Now, Peloton's in deep trouble. And it's those rapid changes that make it difficult for manufacturers to adjust here. And that's exactly what the auto industry has been dealing with. They've done a great job so far of kind of lowering the expectations because of the fact that they had these supply chain issues. For example, one thing that they had an issue with was getting the computer chips, that's those silicon chips that everybody talks about. Nowadays, cars are little more than computers on wheels. There's so much electronics in them. And as a result of that, it made it hard for the auto manufacturers to make as many cars as were demanded by consumers, based upon, again, these rapid changes in behavior. So as a result of that, the auto manufacturers lowered their production targets, and they've been able to manage based upon that. But what that does, of course, is with less being available, that drives up the cost. And in the long run, that creates a problem here, where you're going to have fewer people saying, oh, I'm willing to go go out and buy that new car and invest in something that I'm going to enjoy. Because right now, between this additional costs and the higher interest rates that we have as a result of the Fed increasing interest rates, the car payments have really gotten to be something that's unsustainable for most Americans.
Yeah, even the used car market having a big effect on Americans every single day. Just over the course of the last few years since the pandemic, the average used car price has gone up 40%, currently right around $29,000. Pre-pandemic, you could get a new car, in some cases, usually sedans or lower level crossovers for about that price. And the average monthly auto loan payment right now, according to the Oakland Press's article from earlier on this month, through the Associated Press, that's currently $729. For a lot of people, that's their high water mark for paying rent, let alone paying for a vehicle. So with a default on some of or many of these loans, with the debt ceiling crisis in the U.S. continuing to loom, that could have a big effect on our economy. In terms of automobiles in the U.S. and in Canada, a growing partnership under negotiation, a plan between Michigan and Canada to create a binational corridor for electric vehicle charging stations. How could this have an impact on both the U.S. and Canada, particularly in that Ontario and Michigan corridor we kind of think of as that immediate partnership, especially given that it's one of the busiest border crossings in all the world?
It is. Yeah, it's amazing, actually. You know, it's kind of one of those things, familiarity breeds contempt. We don't realize how busy this is on a global scale. I mean, this is one of the busiest border crossings in the world, as you say. And actually, Highway 401, which is on the Canadian side of the border, as you go up a little bit and get close to Toronto, that is actually the busiest freeway in the entire world. Hard to believe, but that's the case. So you're talking some roads, and they're talking about going between Kalamazoo and Quebec City in Canada, that are some of the busiest and most important thoroughfares in the entire world, and certainly heavily used for industry, heavily used for manufacturing. So this is really kind of quite critical. And I think it was demonstrated by the fact that Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg actually came to Michigan for this announcement. It was such a big deal. And of course, the governor was there, as well as representatives from Canada. But essentially what we're talking about here is that for this corridor going from Kalamazoo up to Quebec City, which includes, of course, Detroit, London, Toronto, Montreal, kind of the large cities here in this corridor, you're talking about trying to have quick charging facilities available for EVs every 50 miles at least, if not closer than that. So it'll really make it so it's much more convenient for people driving electric vehicles to be able to go up and down this corridor. And, you know, what I find exciting about this actually is that it's helping deal with this chicken and egg syndrome that we've got going on right now with EVs, which is that on the one hand, people are saying, you know, oh, yes, we'd like to have EVs, but we're concerned about the fact that we might not have access to charging facilities when we need them. You know, frankly, I had that exact same situation last time I was looking for a vehicle. On the other hand, you've got the private investors saying, you know, I don't know if we necessarily want to invest in this because we don't know that there are enough EVs out there to deliver us the kind of return on investment that we want to see to make this a profitable investment for us. So as a result of that, you kind of have both sides not really wanting to go forward and need something to break the logjam. And this is something that government can do very, very effectively. And frankly, part of the reason that we've got the kind of air transportation system we've got in the United States is because of the fact that through airmail, actually, the U.S. government stepped in and said, we're going to end up supporting the development of commercial air transit across the United States. Same thing for the freeways, you know, where the government stepped in and said, you know, we're going to build the interstate freeway system. So at each step, you can see where the government has stepped in and kind of encouraged the development of these processes that then kind of start the ball rolling. And I think that's kind of what we're starting to see here, which is that the government's saying, look, you know, we're going to essentially make this investment here. We're going to break this log jam, and suddenly more people will be willing to perhaps buy EVs as a result of the fact that they know that there are these frequent charging stations on routes that so many of them will go on. And as a result of that, then that will encourage the production of more EVs, and that then will encourage the production of more electric charging facilities at convenient locations. And you can see where just one thing feeds into the other. And so I think it's a real credit to the government that they were willing to step in and do this.
Yeah, it certainly fits well within the Biden administration, certainly the Buttigieg Department of Transportation's plans for the near future in the coming years, especially should they get a second term in office, to really push forward building the electric vehicle market in the U.S., both on the manufacturing side and on the distribution side, having those charging stations, especially in a busy corridor between the U.S. and Canada, going through Michigan and through this region of America, would be a huge help in making that happen. Finally today, and this is something right within your wheelhouse, being that you have a history of working in local government, a millage failure in Berkley could bring some big changes in the city, particularly the city services. And we've seen this of late in many places. It happens quite regularly, actually, that a city will put forth a millage proposal for its citizens to vote on in a regular election or even in a special election, depending on the necessity and depending on the will of their local city, village council, the township board, in order to pay for betterment of services, improvements, and so on and so forth. In the case of Berkley, the city council had to approve their fiscal budget on Monday of this week, and unfortunately, because of a millage proposal failing, that's already going to have an impact on next year's budget and going forward. So give us some insight on that, on how these decisions are made from a municipality to put forth a budget, and then what happens if they put this forward, they make that informational campaign. Of course, they are not allowed to campaign in favor or against a millage. What they do after the fact, if that millage ends up failing, and they have to go back to the drawing board on their budgets.
Yeah, this goes back to the Headley Amendment, which some of the, the more gray-haired folks in the audience like me probably remember passing back in, I think it was the 1980s. And what the Headley Amendment did is it basically limited the speed of growth in property taxes. And the problem was that you had people who'd lived in their homes for their entire lives and who had paid off their mortgages suddenly losing their homes as a result of the fact that the property taxes were going up so fast. And the way that property taxes are calculated, of course, is that they're calculated based upon the market value of the house. So say that the market value of real estate went up, even if the taxes themselves weren't being increased, the tax rate wasn't being increased, the taxes themselves were going up because the value of the house that the taxes were calculated based upon was going up very rapidly. So what the Headley Amendment sought to do is to limit the pace at which the value of homes can increase on a taxable basis. And many of us who own homes probably know this when we've seen our tax bills, and we have one line where it talks about the fair market value of the home. On the next line, they'll have the taxable value of the home, and typically that's much lower than the fair market value. Well, what essentially ends up happening is that when the house gets sold, the fair market value gets reset. The taxable value gets reset to whatever the sale price was of the home, and then the increase per year is limited based upon the rate of inflation. So seems to make sense. The problem that you run into, though, is particularly for communities like Berkley and Warren, where I used to work, which are more fully developed, don't have a lot of new housing stock coming online. Whenever you get into a situation where you have enough of these property sales happening that the amount of taxes going up actually goes up by a reasonable amount, then Headley requires them to actually reduce the taxable value entirely, the tax rates that's being charged. And so that creates kind of a problem. And it's not a problem, interestingly enough, in communities that have a lot of new housing construction. Those new houses, interestingly enough, do not have that impact upon the budget where the towns have to lower the amount, essentially the tax rate that they're charging. So I know that I'm kind of getting a little into the weeds here, but I think it's important background to point out here, because it creates this kind of two-tiered system where you've got the older communities that struggle with the taxes not being able to go up, and the newer communities that, frankly, as new developments come online, they have new taxable value coming in, and so they end up being very wealthy. Well, that's where Berkeley's struggling right now, is that they don't have this new this new housing value coming online. And as a result of that, what they did is they went to the voters and basically asked, hey, can you give us this extra room under the Headley Amendment, what's called a Headley override, allow us to have a little bit more breathing room with our taxes. And as it turns out, the voters, by about 54% to 46%, said no. So as a result of that, Berkeley has to make cuts. Most of the income that most communities get, including Berkeley, are property taxes. And as a result of that, when you do have such severe limitation, then it means something needs to go, something needs to be cut. In Berkeley's case, they have two approaches that they're taking. Number one, they've got some funds from the federal government as a result of the COVID, the COVID funding that was made available to local communities that they're able to use. And they're going to use about $500,000 of that this year, $500,000 of that next year. But that, even with that, that still means that this year and next year, they still need to cut about $500,000 from their budget, which in a relatively small community like Berkeley, as you can imagine, is a sizable amount. So they're talking about cutting services. They're talking about cutting hours at the library. They're talking about not having things like leaf pickup anymore. So it can have a significant impact on the city's budget. What's really scary, though, is once those COVID funds run out 3 years from now, all of a sudden, they're going to find an even bigger gap in the budget, and they're going to have to essentially cut twice as much as they would have had to cut now. So I think that the local community leaders are really concerned about it. They realize what they need to do, and ultimately, it's the voters who decide how this is going to proceed. But I can tell you that it's a difficult situation to be in as a municipal employee, finding yourself having to cut back on services that have been provided for some time.
Yeah, we've seen in recent years a number of these sorts of millages being passed through in our local area here in Oakland County, and others that have failed as well, even fairly recently in our flagship area in Keiko Harbor, a millage to support further funding for their local police department, having failed in the special election just at the beginning of this month. Michael, thank you as always for joining us.
Great to be here. Have a great weekend, Tyler.